Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit and welcome to my top 10 games of 2015. This is a yearly tradition for the channel and for almost every other gaming channel on the internet. Certainly not original by any means, but it always seems to do well, and it's a nice little bit of punctuation at the end of the year for this channel. As always, my top 10 games are defined by one single piece of criteria, which is how much did I enjoy this game? I'll explain to you why, but that is always going to be the reason it's on the list. That's going to be the reason that it is the place that it is on the list. And of course, games that I have not played will not make it on the list. This includes titles such as The Witcher 3, which is missing from my list because I did not play it. All of these sort of top 10 lists are, of course, subjective, but every now and again, there does seem to be this overall feeling online that something is so good that it should transcend all of that and be put on a list anyway. This is not that kind of list, and that is not going to happen. Now that you know that, and we've got that out of the way, it is time for me to begin my top 10 games of 2015, based entirely on which I enjoyed the most. Number 10. Mad Max. This might be a bit of a surprise to some people, considering how much I criticized Mad Max in my video of it earlier in the year. You're right, I did. Absolutely. That game has a lot of faults. It has a lot of problems. There are some critics that gave it a very low score and very negative review. And you know what? I don't disagree with any of them. But the game does have some elements that I enjoyed a great deal. Enjoyed them enough to, upon recollection, bring me to the conclusion that actually in my time playing Mad Max, I had enough fun with it to justify putting it on this list. Mad Max is an open-world game in which the most enjoyable moments take place inside a vehicle fighting other vehicles. Vehicular combat is, for some reason, something that has not been perhaps as well represented in games as I would like. Classics of the genre such as Interstate 76 and Vigilante 8 are games that I enjoyed a great deal because I just love the idea of driving around at high speed in a custom car that has weapons strapped to it. It's generally high stakes, high octane, high speed stuff, and I find that to be very compelling and certainly something that would get the adrenaline pumping. Mad Max features a very unique vehicular combat system, in which you are able to utilize a harpoon to pull off various parts of the vehicle. It focuses for the most part on ramming, and using parts of your vehicle to do damage to the enemy, as opposed to firing weapons that are integrated into the vehicle at the target. So you're using things like the spikes on your wheels to do damage, the spikes on your car will prevent boarding. You're able to use burners to do fire damage, and of course use your harpoon to pull off various parts of the vehicle. I found this approach to vehicular combat to be particularly enjoyable and well implemented. It certainly helps that the game is based in the ideal venue for it, a large open desert in which you can have high-speed chases without having to worry too much about crashing into things other than the stuff that you're aiming at. The post-apocalyptic desert environment to me was actually quite compelling, not to mention extremely visually impressive, and it certainly did not hurt that the game was one of the most graphically impressive yet best performing titles on PC in 2015, probably one of the best multi-platform releases of a AAA game that we have seen in quite some time. The game ran really well, and as such was a joy to play at a high frame rate, which certainly contributes to my enjoyment of the title. I also enjoyed the characters which I got to interact with, not least of which the sidekick, who was consistently spouting religious-style rhetoric about automobiles, which I thought was really thematic and actually very enjoyable to listen to. I was always looking forward to his comments on whatever new area that I happened to find myself in, and his very colorful interpretations and metaphors for what was going on. The sidecast of villains was particularly cool as well, with some great examples of flamboyant, over-the-top, and in many cases thoroughly downright evil antagonists. To me, the game was very much let down by its forced ground combat, as well as its emphasis on collectathon side activities, which thankfully in some ways could be bypassed later on in the game. I certainly think that open world syndrome holds back Mad Max more than it really should. With some refinement, I really do think that Mad Max could have been one of the best games of 2015. It wasn't, but the elements that I did enjoy in the title were enjoyable enough and unique enough to let it barely scrape in as an entry on my list. As Joe from Mad Max Fury Road would have said, mediocre. Number 9. Sunless Sea. As a rule, I'm fairly skeptical about any game that labels itself as roguelike. For one thing, roguelike has a very specific definition that has been warped over the last few years to mean pretty much any game with some sort of permanent death, as well as some procedural generation and unlocks over time. The better term, I believe, is roguelite. Certainly roguelike elements, roguelike inspiration, and Sunless Sea is certainly a game that has that. What it does do, which other roguelites do not do, is focus on the narrative, and it does so in a way that is very intriguing. Sunless Sea is a game about exploring a very strange underground world. The Undersea, as they call it, is an eerie green glowing ocean filled with islands, cities, and outposts, and some interesting cosmic horror inspiration. It's also a game that's filled with dark and interesting humor, as well as a plethora of intriguing quests and very interesting characters. It's a game that doesn't take things too quickly. In fact, it's a very slow-paced game that some people have certainly, and perhaps in their mind rightly, criticized it for being. It is not a game that actively focuses on combat. However, it is a game that has some very interesting survival and management elements when it comes to conserving your resources. It definitely gives you a little bit of an FTL vibe when you play Sunless Sea, as you make sure that your crew members don't go insane and that you're stocked with sufficient fuel and food to make sure that they don't have to resort to cannibalizing each other. What you have with Sunless Sea is a very unique and interesting setting. A setting so good that it's able to overcome some of the game's other shortcomings. While of course I did see repeated content as I played multiple sessions of Sunless Sea, every time I started a new game, I was very intrigued to see where my adventure would take me and what new and strange things would be occurring in the Undersea environment. This is one of the few games that gets me to stop and read quest text. That's a very difficult thing to do, and any game that allows me to engage with and enjoy the narrative without actually focusing as much as I usually do on the game mechanics has done something a little bit special. That is certainly how I view Sunless Sea, and that is why it made a spot on my list. Number 8. Vermintide. This game by Fat Shark says, hey, Warhammer's great, let's actually set something in the end times period of Warhammer fantasy. This game is a cooperative, horde-based multiplayer title which pits you as a variety of 5 Warhammer archetypes against the Skaven Ratmen. It does so in a way that focuses very much on melee combat, as well as optional objectives in order to unlock better loot at the end of the session. Vermintide has a lot of things going for it in a genre that I personally don't enjoy a great deal. For one thing, of course, it has the Warhammer setting, which is expertly executed with accuracy and obvious love for the franchise. This is certainly not a cash-in title on the Warhammer name, and there have been plenty of those over the last couple of years. Games Workshop has been far too liberal with their license and allowed companies that clearly don't give a toss about the Warhammer universe to just create awful games based on it. Thankfully, Vermintide is not one of them. It's easily the best Warhammer game of 2015. There is no doubt about that in my mind, and the theme greatly helps make the product more interesting. The focus on melee combat, to me, is what engrossed me in the title more than games which are based, for the most part, on firearms. You're looking at a title where you get right into the face of your enemy, you can cut off body parts and smash in heads with warhammers, daggers, giant swords, and all sorts of other things. It gives it this very visceral feeling, and the visual feedback as well as the audio feedback that you get from being in the thick of it with your friends is very enjoyable. A great addition to the game, which other co-op shooters don't necessarily have, is a loot system. If you are able to complete a level, you can roll on a loot table, which will hopefully give you access to a higher rarity loot item which you can use, whether it be an accessory or some sort of weapon. The amount of weapon variety, especially with the post-launch updates so far, is really quite good, and the pursuit of ever higher quality weapons, enchantments, and crafting of the exact thing that you're looking for is a reason to keep playing, which I think a lot of these co-op multiplayer horde games actually lack. I imagine this game would be higher up the list if it were not for the negative experiences that I had with the public player base. This is the sort of game that you ideally want to play with friends, especially considering that diving into public games puts you at great risk of wasting your time without receiving any loot. The fact that losing the level means that you don't get to roll on the loot table can be especially harmful if you end up in a group that doesn't know what it's doing, or worse still, is deliberately trying to ruin the game for you. This is of course a problem that is widespread amongst multiplayer titles, but it certainly affected my personal enjoyment of Vermintide in 2015, and as a result it maybe knocked it a little bit further down the list than it otherwise would have been. But hey, that's what the list is based on, my personal enjoyment, and Vermintide certainly was hindered by some of the clueless puppies that you tend to run into. It's a great co-op horde-based game though, and I think it's a title that future games in the genre should certainly take a few cues from. For the longest time, Left 4 Dead has been held up as the gold standard for the co-op horde-based multiplayer game, and I have a feeling that it might just now have a contender in Warhammer Vermintide. Number 7. Renowned Explorers International Society. This turn-based tactics title from Abbey Games is a great example of what you can do with the FTL formula. What I mean by that is what I call node-based exploration. If you've played FTL, you'll know that it's about warping from location to location in a node-based grid. Each node will contain some kind of event. That event could be that there is no event. It could also be combat. It could be something which gives you a benefit. It could be something that gives you a penalty. Some games have attempted to do this. Renowned Explorers, I think, does a really, really good job of it. It presents you with a fictional location in which to explore as a group of 3 explorers looking to become the most famous in the world. You take your 3-person party through the island, selecting these nodes, hopefully grabbing the ones that you feel will be of most benefit to you, while avoiding those that would not, taking on combat and challenges and collecting resources. Since you only have a limited amount of supply, you can't visit every node in the area, so you have to make some choices when it comes to your exploration. Renowned Explorers puts an interesting twist on this idea by having you return to your headquarters in between each expedition, and giving you an opportunity to spend the various kinds of currency in order to upgrade your party, buy equipment, conduct research, as well as creating a retinue that can benefit you passively as you go on throughout the game. The meat of this title outside of the exploration is the combat that you will run into from time to time, and this is where they have some very interesting ideas and systems at play. Firstly, the game features a mood system, and these are, for all intents and purposes, status effects that interact either positively or negatively with each other. Depending on the type of actions that you're taking, it will change the overall mood of the battle. And this mood will either give you advantages or penalties depending on what your party's attitude is in relation to the enemy party. It does work a little bit like rock, paper, scissors, but it also determines the kind of approach that you want to take throughout the game. Taking aggressive actions will work well in certain situations, but not in others, and if you wish to commit fully to being, for instance, either friendly or devious, you may be put into situations where it's disadvantageous to be. So you have to decide whether or not you want to stick to your guns, or whether you simply want to exploit the situation in the most optimal way possible. While the theme for many people might be rather transparent in the case that it's just doing damage to a health bar by another name, it does create some very interesting mechanical interaction, and it actually adds a lot of depth to the combat. There's quite a lot that you can learn, and you have to plan often several turns ahead in order to create the right sort of mood and environment to allow your abilities to hit as hard as they possibly can. This is especially true on the higher difficulty levels, and that game is by no means easy. The game is helped along a great deal by a cast of colourful characters, as well as customizable captains, which can be chosen at the start of your expedition, which will give you a number of different benefits, which will no doubt affect your playstyle. The customization of the party and the different synergies between the characters that you have available to you mean that there are a lot of different combinations, and as a result, a lot of different playthroughs. The playthroughs last just long enough, in my honest opinion, generally being beaten in about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the difficulty. And that to me hits the sweet spot for the length of a play session in a game focused on roguelite replayability. Long story short, it's a really well-created tactics game with awesome roguelite progression elements, as well as a colourful and enjoyable theme, which I found myself compulsively going back to for session after session after session. If you enjoy turn-based tactics and FTL was up your alley, then I would urge you not to ignore Renowned Explorers International Society. Number 6. Rainbow Six Siege. Here's something that I did not expect to be on the list and is a very late addition to it. I was not enthused when I saw the announcement of Rainbow Six Siege, especially when I learned that it would not in fact have a single-player campaign, something that the Rainbow Six games have had since their inception, and I have personally very much enjoyed. There is absolutely no doubt that Rainbow Six Siege is a major departure from the slow-paced, tactical and extremely planning-orientated Rainbow Six games of the past. However, it surprisingly enough manages to capture the essence of some of what I enjoyed about those games, while also creating an extremely enjoyable and rather innovative multiplayer shooter in and of its own right. Siege is at its heart a 5-on-5 FPS with an attack-defense scenario. The team on the attack is required to breach and secure the objective and or kill all enemies, and the team on defense is required to defend said objective until the timer expires or indeed kill all enemies. The way that they do this is what makes the game truly interesting and something that I haven't really seen a great deal of before. This is a game, again, about planning. That's the essence, perhaps, of Rainbow Six right there, and yet they've managed to capture it in a multiplayer format. You're required to breach a heavily defended area. The way that you do this is by using the various abilities that the different character classes have, such as Thermite, breaching hammers, cluster explosives, and more besides. The defenders also have a number of gadgets at their disposal in order to make the progress of the enemy more difficult. Many parts of the level can be breached or destroyed entirely, so they're able to reinforce certain walls and doors with barriers that are much harder to get through. They're also able to deploy things like anti-grenade defenses, signal jammers, and even simple defenses like barbed wire and remote detonated explosives. All of these things result in a very tense and very different multiplayer experience. It is not the sort of thing where you rush around trying to kill people as quickly as possible. It's perhaps most comparable to the slower-paced, methodical style of Counter-Strike, and yet even then, it distinguishes itself in a great many ways. The fact that the game is split into two phases, the first of which involves the attackers attempting to find the objective and determine the sort of defenses they're going to be facing, and the defenders creating said defenses while attempting to deny information to the attackers by spotting and killing the drones, is not only a very interesting change of pace, but it's a great way to turn the time necessary to setting up the defenses into something of a little bit of a tense mini-game. I mean, otherwise, the attacking team would just be sitting around doing nothing, but actually they're frantically looking for the bomb, the hostage, or whatever it is they're trying to figure out. They're trying to hide their drones in a position where they can't be spotted, and the defenders simultaneously have to worry about those drones, as well as creating their defenses before the attack begins. When the main phase of the game kicks in, it's a really tense and interesting experience which relies an awful lot on the amount of information that you have, as well as denying information to either side by destroying cameras, destroying drones, and of course trying to stay quiet and out of sight. It's a very interesting calm before the storm, and when that storm hits, when the attackers attempt to actually breach the room, it's a flurry, it's a furious firefight, it's a maelstrom. Each round is a slow burning build-up to absolute mayhem, and it's incredibly satisfying as a result. I found the gunplay of Siege to be highly enjoyable. It has great sound assets, not to mention the fact that each weapon feels like it's got a good amount of punch to it. It also integrates elements such as lean and proper prone mechanics in order to make the game just that little bit more tactical, a little bit more about sneaking and positioning, as well as lines of fire, as opposed to twitch shooting capability. And the ever-present risk of environmental destruction really makes you rethink just how safe your cover actually is. When someone can quite literally poke a hole in a wall, then either shoot through it or toss a grenade into it, that changes the entire dynamic. And you know what? It also means that no play session is ever alike. Yes, there are a limited number of maps, but they are deformed in unique ways every single time, which means that every map plays out just a little bit differently. That's also down to the composition of each team. The operators available on each side will dictate the tactics that are used. You know, if you have a very shield-heavy composition, it's quite likely that the attack will be a full frontal assault, a breach and clear. If the attacking team has thermite, they will be able to get through reinforced walls, which means you have to think about a whole different angle of attack, and I don't get bored of Rainbow Six Siege as a result. It's been criticized for a lack of meaningful single player. It's been criticized for being what is essentially a $60 multiplayer-only release. And you know what? Of all of the full-price multiplayer releases this year, this is the only one that I think actually justifies the price tag fully. The game is by no means perfect. It doesn't perform anywhere near as well as I would like it to at the moment. I don't really know why that is. It certainly has bugs. I really cannot tell you how frustrating it is to be knocked out of a round simply because your prone legs poked through a wall and someone just put a pistol right up next to it and opened fire. The matchmaking could certainly do with some work, and for some reason my in-game voiceover IP refuses to operate, I assume because I use a high-end audio interface. However, the time that I have had with this game, which admittedly has mostly been spent playing with friends, has been some of the most enjoyable multiplayer that I've had. I feel myself getting progressively better at this game and enjoying it more and more the more that I learn about it. It's got tons of layers of hidden depth, and it is genuinely original, which you absolutely do not expect out of Ubisoft. This seemed like a cash-in. This seemed like it was a game that was just exploiting the brand name of something that had a lot of cult appeal. But in my eyes, that isn't true, and this is actually a worthwhile and worthy reinvention of the franchise. Siege is, weirdly enough, one of the most original shooters we got this year. Number 5. Transformers Devastation. It's a Platinum game, so it's a shoo-in on my top 10 games list, right? But usually yes, unless your name is Legend of Korra. Platinum is one of my most consistently favored developers simply because almost everything they've ever made I've enjoyed a great deal. That's mostly down to them producing games almost exclusively in a genre that I like, which is the character action or spectacle fighter game. There was a risk that Transformers Devastation would certainly not be a good title considering it is a licensed game, and Legend of Korra was the weakest title that Platinum has ever made by a country mile. So I was a little cautious, but as it turns out, I didn't need to be. Transformers Devastation is a great spectacle fighter in the vein of classic Platinum titles. It is high speed, high octane, extremely colorful, and very enjoyable with a decent amount of combat depth as well as a surprising amount of weapon variety and different playstyles as a result of the variety of characters available. The combat system feels extremely tight and responsive, and it combines a wide variety of flamboyant and effective melee attacks with so-called vehicle attacks, which certainly suit the Transformers theme a great deal. While it's cool to see Optimus Prime beat people up with electrified power knuckles or a sword, of course the most thematically accurate thing that he can do is transform into a truck and ram people through the air at high speed. The game knows this, the game incorporates it, and also does a good job overall with the incorporation of the vehicular transformation into the gameplay. The game takes some surprisingly interesting little risks here and there and includes some sections that personally I would have hoped would have been fleshed out on, but do add something of a nice bit of variety to an otherwise relatively short single-player campaign. If I had a big criticism of the game, it would be the length. To me, I don't really mind playing a 5 or 6 hour campaign. In fact, that's actually a pretty good length. I like to be able to get through a game, move on to the next one, and feel like I've had a full experience. But of course, for a lot of other people, 6 hours with limited replayability is not great value at full price. I can certainly understand that. For me, the value proposition is less important, and the enjoyment that I had with this game was pretty much total. I don't recall a single instance in the game of me thinking, good lord, I wish this section would end. It seems like they paced it very, very well, and they kept the pacing up and they kept the stakes up throughout the entire game, resulting in a somewhat breathless and exhausted conclusion to 6 or 7 hours of constant colorful violence. Transformers Devastation is yet another great use of a license by a great studio, and I thoroughly enjoyed it in 2015. Number 4. Lovers in a Dangerous Spacetime. This game is a 2D, 2-player co-op space shooter. It's by a company called Asteroid Base, and it is perhaps the purest form of co-op gameplay that you will find this year. Co-op is a feature that has been around for a very, very long time, but it hasn't necessarily always been all that well implemented. There's a difference between allowing you to play with somebody else and building a game entirely around having to cooperate with somebody else. Lovers in a Dangerous Spacetime is the latter. Even in its single-player mode, there are still two characters. You just happen to be able to give orders to the second one. This game is best played with a friend, or indeed with a girlfriend, wife, boyfriend, husband, whatever you happen to like. And it's a very stressful game, despite looking extremely colorful and cute. Do not be deceived, young one. No, no, no. This is a game about surviving in a very, very dangerous space-time indeed. Your ship is awkwardly shaped and has far too many systems for you to operate with only two people. You have to cooperate and communicate in order to prioritize which system you use, since you can only use two at once. Should you disable the engines in order to activate the shields? Should you use two turrets at once to give you extra firepower at expense of defense? Should you switch between the two rapidly? Should you activate your super weapon? Great question. You're going to be yelling at your partner to figure out which is right, and no doubt you will get it wrong frequently, but that's half the fun. You're working together in a hostile environment, and you're trying your best to communicate and make sure that you don't die in the process. That's what co-op gaming is to me. That is the essence of the genre. It's not, hey, let's add another dude and increase the HP of the enemies. No, no, no. It's about true cooperation and the fun social element that can come from that. That's why co-op games are so much fun. Because you're getting to interact with another person. Lovers in a Dangerous Spacetime is an example of an experience that this year I've mostly got from board games, not from a video game. Lovers, on the other hand, is able to provide that experience to me in the medium that I love the most, and that's why I like it as much as I do. Challenging, colorful, creative, heartwarming in places, but extremely challenging and frustrating in others, Lovers in a Dangerous Spacetime is the quintessential co-op game. It's dragged down by the fact that there is no online co-op available on PC, and of course it hasn't sold many copies as a result. In the world of voiceover IP, in the world of being able to, with almost no latency, communicate with another person halfway across the world, for God's sake, put co-op online in your game, please. I just want to see you do well. I really do. Please, don't make this mistake again. Number 3. Dirty Bomb. This multiplayer-only free-to-play shooter by Splash Damage, the creators of Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, as well as the somewhat less-liked Brink, was my surprise hit of 2015 in terms of the amount of time I spent playing it. I clocked up about 100 hours of play for Dirty Bomb throughout its 2015 release, and I have to say that for the most part it was thoroughly enjoyable. I have a little bit of a soft spot for objective-focused shooters, particularly those that have multiple objectives that stack on top of each other. Splash Damage has been the studio that I think embraced this design philosophy the most. They did it a lot in Wolfenstein Enemy Territory. It was a key theme of Quake Wars and also of Brink. I love the idea of starting at one side of a level and ending at the other. The most common way of doing this is, of course, a payload-style map, although in the case of Splash Damage, they also use destructible barriers, which puts a nice little game type involving demolition into play. This means that you're gradually moving through the level with different checkpoints and you're seeing different terrain every time. So despite the fact that the game only has a limited number of maps, these maps are absolutely huge and are really 3 maps in one in many instances. Dirty Bomb is a relatively fast-paced, objective-focused shooter in which you play various character classes that have a primary and secondary weapon as well as a melee, and usually an ability or two on top of that. You have a couple of basic archetypes such as healers and objective experts, but for the most part, every class is combat effective. That's a little bit of a departure from what some class-focused FPS have done in the past, in which they're more than willing to make a class much less effective at combat just because of the other things that they can do. Due to a shared weapon pool, Dirty Bomb departs somewhat from this idea by allowing classes that would maybe traditionally have much less firepower to still wield something with a lot of punch. For instance, you can play as a medic who still has a very powerful close-range shotgun, and you can compete even with the very combat-focused characters. For better or worse, this also means that you have a decent amount of choice within the character archetypes. One healer can be quite easily replaced by another, since the abilities are not too dissimilar, and of course, there are certain shooters in which some classes are absolutely indispensable. One thing that I really enjoyed about Dirty Bomb was its gunplay. While it doesn't completely do away with the ability to aim down sights, it does not make the aim down sights function magically more accurate. It will help you zoom in, absolutely, but for the most part, you'll actually want to be firing from the hip. This means, of course, that the combat is a lot more fast-paced and tends to reward high accuracy while moving. It's quite important that a multiplayer shooter does shooting well, and Dirty Bomb thankfully does. That's not, of course, to say that Dirty Bomb has not had its problems this year. It has, upon some occasions, released overpowered characters, the most egregious of which was absolutely Phantom, an inexplicably tough stealth character with a melee weapon that could one-shot people while coming out of stealth. That was not a particularly good idea, and thankfully they did nerf the character later on. There have also been some questionable decisions in terms of monetization, although earlier on in the year they were, frankly, very much misrepresented by people within the games media as well as on YouTube and Twitch in the claims that the game was very much pay to win. This was clearly not true, with the addition of premium crates only giving cosmetic upgrades as opposed to any sort of actual power. And it's rather unfortunate that this misrepresentation seems to have stuck. While I think that having to grind or pay to unlock characters can certainly be disadvantageous in this kind of game, it is a free-to-play title, and I think that for the most part, it's done it relatively well. It's certainly no TF2 in terms of its overall level of fairness, but we have to consider that TF2 used to be a premium game and is in a very unique position in terms of its monetization. I don't think Dirty Bomb did that too badly, and for the most part, it has been pretty fair for free-to-play players versus those that are willing to pay money. I've had a lot of fun with Dirty Bomb this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops, particularly competitively, in 2016. Number 2. Duck Game. Ha ha ha, I said to myself upon seeing this title. Is this memes? I would have said if I was 10. But, as it turns out, Duck Game is just honesty in advertising. It is a game about ducks. It is a duck game. It may be the duck game. And of course, it is by Landon Podbielski. Of course. I mean, who else would it be by? This is a multiplayer deathmatch game in which you play as a duck. The duck has access to various weapons which are littered throughout the level, and in most instances it is a one-shot kill. A very simple principle, right? Yes, absolutely, but incredibly well executed. This is a game following in the footsteps of titles like Towerfall, but also with a healthy little bit of influence from games like Super Smash Bros. It's a very tense and very, very fast-paced multiplayer game. The rounds can be over almost instantly, but what really amuses me about Duck Game, what sets it apart and what makes it consistently interesting is the amount of level variety. This is a quick-fire game in which you are thrown into a level and you are immediately expected to adapt to whatever is happening with it, and there are a lot of different variations. These variations exploded with the addition of Steam Workshop support. The game had a lot of levels to begin with. Now it has huge numbers of levels as well as a thriving modding scene. In terms of the simplest form of pure enjoyment that I received this year from video games, Duck Game runs away with it because it's all that game is. It's a game where I'm finding myself consistently screaming in excitement at what's going on. It's a game that's a huge amount of fun to play with either friends or random people. It's a game that consistently sets you up for hilarious moments. Getting mad at a death in Duck Game is less likely than laughing your arse off at a death in Duck Game. It can be accidental, it can be in one of the weirdest possible ways as a result of the wide variety of hazards available on levels and a huge variety of different weapons, some of which you would not assume were as lethal as they look, and the game has a dedicated, pitchable, modulatable quack button. A first for video games. Blissfully, with a game like this, it seems like the developer actually had some common sense and released a title like this on PC that actually had proper online support that worked. I cannot fathom as to why games within this genre would omit this particular feature, particularly on PC, a platform in which online play is the preferred multiplayer method, but there is a reason as to why this game is still getting played and none of the other ones are. You could do an awful lot worse than diving into Duck Game, a game that is extremely simple to get into, but incredibly hard to master, and a game that is consistently funny always, forever. I don't think it will ever cease being hilarious. Sometimes great gaming comes in an unassuming and very simple package. Duck Game is the essence of that idea. Number 1. Hey, viewer. Yes, you. If you have this window minimized, if you're not paying attention, then please look at the screen right now, because you have to make a choice. I'll give you 20 seconds to think about it. Undertale. I don't think I'll ever forget Undertale. This retro-inspired RPG of sorts by Toby Fox stands as a member of a very small elite club. That club is a game that surpassed my expectations completely when it came to the melding of game mechanics and storytelling. A couple of years ago, I told you that Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons was my favorite game of all time, and I gave you the reasons for that, and one of the main reasons was that game's ability to seamlessly take two ideas, the idea of ludology and the idea of narrative, and marrying them together in a way that does not create dissonance. That to me is the apex of what games are capable of. That to me is the holy grail which you need to pursue if you want to see games elevated to the truest potential of the medium. That is a goal that the vast majority of games do not achieve. That doesn't make those games bad, and in fact some of my favorite games of all time, the vast majority of my favorite games of all time, strictly fall into the category that do not achieve that. It is a very, 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 very small group of games that manages to do that. Undertale joins that club. But Undertale does it in a very different way. Undertale does it in a way that completely subverts expectations consistently in order to play with you, just as you attempt to play it. To explain fully as to how Undertale does this would require me to spoil Undertale for you. It's quite a similar situation to Brothers. The crowning moment of that game is something that I can't tell you because it would spoil it for you. That's an experience that I want you to have for yourself. I want you to hopefully get as much out of that as I did, although I know that that's not always going to be the case. What I can do is try to explain to you exactly what I really like about Undertale and why I enjoyed it more than anything else this year. When you've played a huge amount of video games, and when you play them for a living, it becomes increasingly more difficult to surprise you. I love surprises. Surprises and the subversion of expectations are things that I hold a great deal of respect for, as well as derive a great deal of value from. Undertale manages to do this in a way that I haven't seen in video games before, and it does it by recognizing that the player is a player. It does it by recognizing, but in not so obvious a way, that the world is a video game. There have been quite a few games that break the fourth wall, but they do so in a very clumsy manner that's right on the nose. It's not to say that can't be enjoyable and amusing, it often is. But Undertale does not do it that way. Undertale, in an almost disturbing way, creates a world inside a video game that could, if you suspended your disbelief, actually exist in that context. That sounds really strange, doesn't it? And it's so hard for me to explain why it does that and how it does that without spoiling the things that make that happen. But to me, Undertale is a God game. And that sounds very weird, doesn't it? Because God game has a very specific definition. You think of God game, you think of populace, you think of black and white. But in this world, the player is a literal God. Not the character. The player. The game recognizes the existence of the player outside the world in the context of the existence of that world. How do you do that? That's something you've got to play the game yourself, hopefully multiple times to truly understand. If you break down Undertale to its very basics, what you will find is an Earthbound-inspired 8-bit retro RPG in which the combat system is based on a mix of platforming and bullet hell. You are tasked with moving your heart inside the boundaries of the area in order to avoid the various attacks that the enemy is throwing at you, and respond in kind. Or, of course, not. The game has the option to spare everybody, and figuring out exactly how to do that is surprisingly enjoyable. It runs the risk of becoming very repetitive. Each monster, of course, has a different way to spare it, and if you encounter the same monster multiple times, you are most likely going to run into a situation where you're repeating the same actions. The thing is, almost all battle RPGs have exactly the same problem, so it would be unfair to point at Undertale when everyone else also does this. Thankfully, the pacing of Undertale, unless of course you're doing a very specific kind of run, which I would not want to spoil, means that you avoid needless repetition in the vast majority of circumstances. While this battle system on first glance seems very simple, the amount of different things that the developer is able to do with it by subverting your expectations and breaking the game's own rules is astonishing. Each boss fight is memorable for a number of different reasons. The game plays with the mechanics, it inverts the mechanics, it changes the mechanics at a whim. When I said that the game recognizes that it's a game, one of the best examples of that is its willingness to break its own rules. Attacks coming in from outside of the boundaries, the shape of the boundaries consistently changing. The UI is as much a part of the storytelling as everything else is, and that's a very unique thing to me, because the UI of video games is usually there purely from a utilitarian point of view. It is there to present information to you, and generally there's not a lot of effort put into doing anything more than just theming the UI or keeping it out of the way. Undertale does the exact opposite of that. The UI is central not only to your ability to play the game, but also to the narrative and the different boss mechanics. Undertale, in this respect, is unendingly creative. Something that I found very intriguing about Undertale is that I went in knowing that the game was going to screw with me in some way. As a result, that actually affected the way that I played it. Because I knew that the developer knew that I was going to try something, I sometimes tried something differently. I was consistently testing the boundaries and the logic of the game because I knew that the developer had taken the fact that I would do so into account. This level of meta gameplay made the Undertale a consistently intriguing experience, and it goes far, far beyond just little nods to saying, hey, I knew you would do that. The game remembering things that you've done previously when it comes to saving and reloading or even previous playthroughs is not just a clever little nod, it's integral to the entire plot of the game. It's integral to how you interact with the characters and how they interact with you. And to say any more on that subject would of course be spoiling it. This is a game that you learn more about in the second playthrough. If you approach the game as a typical RPG, you probably do what most RPG players do. If there's a monster that attacks you, you fight it, you gain experience, you move on. You absolutely can do that. The choice to actually spare the monsters seems like an arbitrary gimmick, initially, until you realize it's there because why do you want to kill these things? Why are you trying to fight in this situation? As you learn more about the world, you learn more about the creatures within it, even the regular monsters, and you realize, actually, maybe I don't want to kill these guys, and it's nice to have that. There's an infamous and often misquoted old games media article about Doom, asking, well, what if you could talk to the monsters and all that sort of thing? Of course, in that scenario, the ability to talk to the hell-raising, flesh-eating demons would be entirely arbitrary and pointless because that has nothing to do with the setting or objective of the game. But in this case, the ability to speak to the monsters and speak to the characters is integral to playing it. Of course you can speak to them. They're willing to talk with you. They're willing to interact with you, so it's great that I have the option to do that, whereas other games will simply not allow me to do so. I have to fight in other games. This game gives me the choice not to, but makes it mean something. It makes it worthwhile. This is all backed up, of course, by great writing. Humor is a very subjective thing. There are plenty of people who will tell you that Undertale is an unfunny game. Can we eliminate unfunny from the entire English language, please? It's an unword at this point. It doesn't mean anything. You can't be inherently unfunny because of how subjective humor actually is. It's like calling something unmusic. I was fortunate, I think, in having the humor resonate a great deal. And humor is conveyed again through the game mechanics as well as the writing. I met characters I'm not going to forget. I met characters that I wanted to help. I met characters that were just consistently funny and interesting and surprised me all the time. As soon as I thought I knew everything about one character, they threw a curveball at me, and that kept me invested in the narrative, and that to me is very hard to do. I don't invest well in video game narratives, as a rule. But if I've established anything about Undertale at this point, it's that Undertale breaks all the rules. Undertale's a game with heart. Undertale is a game about caring. Undertale is a game about laughing. Undertale is a game about being sad. Undertale is a game about engaging with some thoroughly disturbing and terrifying concepts. Undertale is creepy as much as it is whimsical. Undertale is terrifying. Undertale is scary as much as it is fun and lighthearted. Undertale is Undertale. Undertale is unique. It stands alone. Undertale is not what I expected, in the best possible way. At some point I might do a spoiler video on Undertale so I can truly explain everything about this game, but I would like to just encourage you to play it if you haven't already. It really is truly special, something truly unique in 2015, and as a result it makes the top of my list. Ladies and gentlemen, please do have a great new year. Thank you very much for supporting the channel this year. If you'd like to support this video, then by all means click the like button below. If you didn't like my choices and you think that I should not be having as much fun as I am, then by all means click that dislike button. Make me feel it. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time. Overwatch. You remember at the start of this video that I said my only criteria was how much I enjoyed the game this year? Overwatch is the game that I enjoyed the most this year. Overwatch is a game that I spent a huge amount of time on this year. Overwatch is a game that isn't out yet. Overwatch is a game that's in closed beta and that I played, especially with my friends, a great deal. Overwatch is here because I enjoyed it the most in 2015. That's the only criteria. Overwatch, a game that's coming out in 2016, is to me pushing the multiplayer shooter genre forward. It is a logical evolution on the idea of class-based first-person shooters. It integrates elements from Dota and League of Legends. Of course, it integrates elements from Team Fortress 2, one of the godfathers of the genre. Notice I said godfather there, not grandfather. I'm keenly aware of the older class-based FPS. And it just melds them together in a way that makes something new, that makes something very enjoyable, highly competitive, and extremely fun to play. Where to start with why I like Overwatch? Well, we could start with the large number of classes and the amount of class variety that's going on here. You currently have 21 classes that all perform very different and specific roles, and more importantly, can combine in very interesting synergies with other classes. This again is a principle that you will find in Dota-style games. The classes in Overwatch are not defined by their role. They're not defined by healer, tank, etc., etc. They're defined by who they are. They're defined by their kit, as well as, of course, the design of their character. It's perhaps one of the only games outside of Team Fortress 2 that genuinely creates characters, not classes, defined by more than just what they can do. It certainly helps a great deal that each character is just so interesting. They have well-written backstories and lore. They all have very well-defined and unique looks and silhouettes. They have great voice acting and awesome quotes that are very memorable and certainly have the potential to become iconic in the context of video games. And Overwatch has already, before even releasing created a very well-defined identity for itself. Of course, it wouldn't be an FPS without good gunplay, as we've mentioned in several titles in this list, and the gunplay in Overwatch is a bit unique compared to the other titles that I've listed. We're not talking about realistic gunplay here, by any means, but what we are talking about is gunplay that is not afraid to experiment. We're talking about gunplay which is taking inspiration, perhaps in equal part, from the arena shooters of old and the Dota-style games of today. For every Quake rocket, this game has some sort of unusual semi-auto-lock weapon, such as the Winston Tesla cannon. These weapons encourage very unique playstyles on a character-by-character basis, and they also allow for the skill ceiling to remain high while simultaneously lowering the skill floor, allowing an easier access to people that are perhaps not necessarily invested in the genre. Overwatch to me lowers the barrier to entry while not compromising the ability to play the game competitively. That is a very difficult balance. They have not done it perfectly, and of course there's a lot of refinement to be done there, but they have attempted it, and it seems like for the most part they succeeded so far. More so than anything, I think Overwatch does a great job of encouraging a true team-focused attitude. The simplistic nature of the payload and capture point style of gameplay certainly has a lot to do with that, but I think more importantly is just how visual the abilities are and how it makes sense to work as a team in any given situation. When you see a Reinhardt with his shield up, of course, you're going to move behind it. When a Mercy is buffing your damage, you're going to naturally be more aggressive and open fire with everything you've got. When Zarya throws down her ultimate, you're going to toss all the AoE that you have at it. And it's very natural for players to realize that this is the way to do it. You don't have to be taught to do that because the game does such a good job of visually and orally explaining to you, this is what you should be doing right the hell now. It's explanation through gameplay mechanics. It's explanation through visual flair as opposed to specifically telling you. It's encouraging player behavior rather than drilling it into them, and it's all very organic. It's all very natural. That's not to say that you get teammates that are perfect all the time, but that's not what I'm saying at all. But it is, again, yet another element from the Dota style of game, but implemented into a first-person shooter in a way that works. I've had a ton of fun playing Overwatch this year, no doubt about that. I'm really looking forward to it coming out in 2016. It's certainly not without its problems, and there are plenty of things to fix prior to release, but I do think it's one of the most exciting multiplayer properties in 2016, and it's a shooter that I'm extremely enthused to get in and play every time I have the opportunity to do so. There's always a risk that when you try to appeal to a wide audience, you can sacrifice the depth of a game. You can sacrifice the complexity. You can sacrifice what keeps people coming back for more. That's something that Star Wars Battlefront did this year. That's something that Overwatch did not. They managed to avoid that particular pitfall, in my opinion, and they certainly deserve a lot of praise for that. And I am definitely looking forward to playing more of that in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, that has been my top 10 games of 2015. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, then by all means give me a thumbs up. And if you dislike this video, if you want to tell me to stop liking things that you don't like, then do by all means click the dislike button. Thank you very much for watching, folks. I'll see you next time.